I hear this all the time. A Christian does something inconsiderate, selfish, or even malicious, and atheists comment, well, that's not very Christ-like. And I get that that's an expression on the atheist part, but it seems to stem from a larger issue which I think needs to be discussed. Saying that something is or is not Christ-like assumes that a set standard of Christ-like behavior exists to which any action may be compared. It assumes that the Bible clearly describes a standard which may be somehow externally evidenced or objectively verified. Do you see where I'm going with this? That implication is a problem. Christians sometimes argue about what makes a true Christian. And by sometimes, I mean that there was a whole reformation about this that divided most of European society. And there are thousands of Christian denominations today that actively differentiate themselves from all others and state that their doctrine alone is correct. And, by argue, I mean that people used to kill each other over this, but over time it seems that the most devout have become content with simply asserting that everyone else will burn in hell for all eternity. But most of the time, I think it just manifests itself in nonsensical and passive-aggressive social media interactions. But when Christians do argue about who is or isn't a true Christian, atheists often call them out for using a no true Scotsman. Atheists are right to do this. When everyone conveniently defines Christianity in ways meant to exclude counterexamples, no one holds to an objective standard. It exemplifies that there's no set definition of Christian or Christianity. However, sometimes the same atheists that call out the no true Scotsman fallacies will then see a Christian doing something like being accepting of LGBT people and say, hey, you're not following the Bible, you're not a true Christian. I get where atheists are coming from on that. They're trying to call out religious hypocrisy. But doing so in that way is problematic. Atheists can't, in one breath, point out the subjective nature of Christianity's definition, and in another, call out Christians for violating commandments of what they're assuming is a more correct interpretation. The thing we need to remember here is that there is no true interpretation of the Bible. It's nearly all fiction. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different ways that people interpret the Bible just today. And because they're all based on the same thing, they're all equally right and equally wrong. The source of the information in the pages of the Bible seem to be the imagination of the numerous anonymous authors and their respective cultures. There are relatively few accounts in the Bible which are evidentially affirmed. So there's basically no data outside of the Bible that tells us what interpretation of the stories told is verifiably true. Other than, it's not apparent that any of the events described actually happened. We also can't confirm who any of the writers actually were, so we can't even use our understanding of their literary style or character to discern what they were likely trying to say in any given passage. At best, we can make educated guesses based on the cultural and literary traditions of the people from which the writings originated, but still, there's no certainty. Ultimately, the interpretation of fiction is always subjective. Unless evidentially verified externally, the apparent meaning of any given passage is decided by the reader alone. Because of this, attempting to argue what is or isn't biblical is about as arbitrary as trying to determine what Hogwarts house you really belong to. And if you're wondering, this applies to all other religions and holy books as well. Works of fiction are always subject to interpretation no matter where they come from. Just replace Bible with Quran, Torah, or Book of Mormon, and Christianity with Islam, Judaism, or Mormonism, and all the same points that I've made apply. I say this not because I just think it's important that we're right in all technicalities, but that because acting as if there is a proper interpretation of any scripture undermines the powerful point that no scripture is externally verifiable and is therefore subject to personal interpretation, rendering it entirely meaningless as a means of clearly communicating the mandates of any higher power. So don't call out the religious on what you think is hypocrisy in that way. If you try to compare their actions against what their holy book mandates, you're really just comparing their interpretation against your interpretation, and likely the interpretation of some believers of what their book says. You're legitimizing their text by insinuating that there's actually a proper interpretation of it, rather than asserting that it's entirely fictional, and any interpretation is just as meaningless as any other. If you feel the need to have a conversation about how a believer is motivated by their holy book, maybe bring up a different interpretation and ask them why they don't believe that way. Then just use the Socratic method to uncover that they have no good reason for interpreting the book that way, or really any way for that matter. From there, Maybe you can discuss why a supreme being would communicate supposedly ultimate truth in a way that demands subjective interpretation. Acting as if there is a correct way to interpret any kind of holy text undermines our ability to show the fragility of its assertion that it is inherent ultimate truth. In summation, atheists, stop saying that someone acts in a way that contradicts their religious text, because attempting to correct fiction by asserting different fiction gets no one closer to the truth. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel and I'll greatly appreciate that. You can also follow me on Twitter at GMSkeptic if you want to keep up with me in between videos. And until next time, everyone, stay skeptical.